Thank you. So on this panel, we're going to talk about the issue that is probably on all of your minds after watching what we just watched, which is, if we think we know who these perpetrators may be, if we know who they are, how do we communicate with them in an effective way that actually decreases the chances that they will hurt another person? That's what we're about here. We're about preventing the harm and the violence that we experienced here. And just like in any other relationship you have, there are ways that are effective to communicate and ways that aren't. And we need to understand and do better in how we communicate with the people who are most at risk of being sucked into these movements with these recruiting videos that you've seen, and to understand who we're talking to and how to talk to them is the key question. And so much work has been done, academically and otherwise, about how we talk to each other. How do you talk to policymakers? How do you talk to people in schools? How do you talk to community? But precious little has been done about how we talk effectively to the people who we really need to be talking to. And as you heard Emily describe so eloquently this morning, many of the things that first come to our minds to say are just going to drive people farther and farther away from us. And just think of the argument you had with your children, or that you had with your parents. When you go head to head, what happens? You drive the other person further into what you were trying to convince them not to do. This is a human problem, but we have to figure out how to solve for this problem. And the people we have on this panel are some of the experts in the world at that problem. And Scott, welcome. It's good to see you. I wish you were here, but thank you for being here. We're going to go very quickly through the panel. I am not as good at time management as my dear friend Seamus Hughes, who you saw before, but I'm going to try to live up to his image. We're going to go through the panel really quickly and do just a very few minutes, because each of them has different experience with different areas of the world, but I think you will hear commonalities in what you hear. And after we go through and you understand a little bit who they are, we're going to go back and have a little bit more of an in-depth discussion about how we might get at this problem for all of us, all of us. How do we communicate with these individuals in our communities, in our schools, in our families, right? So that's the purpose of this panel. So Julie, you kindly agreed to lead us off with sort of an overview of this very large problem. So why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm absolutely honored to be on this panel. My name is Julie Chernov Hwang, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Goucher College. I research terrorist behavior in Southeast Asia and am the author of 2 books on the subject: Why Terrorists Quit: The Disengagement of Indonesian Jihadists, which looks at disengagement, reintegration, and rehabilitation, and my new book, Becoming Jihadis: Radicalization, Commitment in Southeast Asia, which looks at the social and emotional components of joining and committing to a group and participating in acts of terrorism. Prevention is hard work, and I'm so heartened by what I've learned these past few days about the programs working in this space and adopting a public health approach. Yudi Zulfakhri, an Indonesian farmer who is now working on his PhD, compared radicalization to becoming sick, and so sick you have to go to the hospital. And he said that he never realized how, quote, sick he was until he got out and went through rehabilitation, reintegration, and looking back, he sees how sick he was. And I want to take half a second and just highlight one of the programs I heard about yesterday, which is the AU Peril Duck program, which is pioneering digital literacy curriculum in elementary schools to understand, so that children can understand at an age-appropriate level what to do when they're encountering toxic messaging on the internet. Thank you to everyone here who is fighting the good fight. I'm going to make a few points based on what we can learn from Indonesia. about how to engage with formers, how to deal with formers, how to work and engage formers. The first is that, and I can't stress this enough, it is so important that as we are thinking about programs, that we involve formers in these conversations, both on the prevention side and the R&R side. They should not simply be used for their stories and traveling around like some kind of road show, but viewed as the subject matter experts. They should be brought in people who are ready, who have gone through the processes of their own disengagement process, their own reintegration process, their own rehabilitation process, and when they are ready, they should be brought in to work in conceptualization of programs, needs assessments, outcomes assessments, curricular development, and peer counseling. And why? On the disengagement, rehabilitation, reintegration side, they have a credibility that someone like me would have a really hard time building, because they have the credibility of their lived experiences. They also know what buttons to push, what verbiage to use, and if and when to start conversations on ideology. However, we need to also keep in mind, and I think a lot of people in the room know this, that disengagement, reintegration, rehabilitation, all of this takes time. It's not going to happen along fiscal year budgets, and we have to think about it in long time horizons. So formers who want to engage in this space need to go through their own reintegration and rehabilitation processes, and when they are ready, they need to be engaged ethically as professionals and trained as professionals. Just as therapists would have group where they would come together once a week and they would talk about their hard cases, so too might peer counselors and peer mentors benefit from group to talk about their hard cases, but also when they're feeling triggered and what that looks like and what they are doing to help. They may need trauma-informed therapists who can help them on this journey, and they need to be treated as paid professionals. I want to speak in my last minute about what's happening in Indonesia, because it's really exciting and I think we can learn so much from them. Increasingly, disengagement programs and reintegration programs are being led by formers, where they are in that conceptualization stage, and some of them are running their own organizations. They're making discussion groups. They're organizing professional development. They're helping families of imprisoned terrorists so that when they get out of prison, they know that it was these groups of formers who helped them, and they're not taking help from the group themselves that radicalized them. They're creating their own brotherhoods of the disengaged and the reintegrating. They're creating their own support networks. And these men are listened to because they have the street cred. Again, I'm going to stress, they know what buttons to push, and they can do incredible things. And I'm going to leave you with one example of those incredible things. In Indonesia, there was a very notorious Islamic boarding school called Al-Islam, and up through 2007, when they were, in addition to teaching the curriculum they taught, which was rigorously Salafi jihadi, they were teaching their youth jihad in a practical way, how to shoot with airsoft guns, and curriculum on urban warfare and guerrilla warfare. And then in 2008, half-brothers Ali Imran, who was one of the Bali bombers, and Ali Fauci, his half-brother, who was a trainer, and their family owned Al-Islam. It was their family school. They presided over a change in the curriculum. Ali Imran, for about a half-decade before that, had been working in prisons, as a prisoner himself, in prisons, holding discussion groups to work on changing some of the understandings around the permissibility of the use of violence. And Ali Fauci was going through his own disengagement and reintegration. And he would go on to start one of Indonesia's most successful disengagement and reintegration programs with the discussion groups and the aid to imprisoned families. And this change in the curriculum de-emphasized the focus, de-emphasized jihad as war, and shifted to holistic focus on Islam. Is this a school that is still very conservative? Absolutely. Do they teach about jihad? Yes, but theoretically, and it's not a central component of the curriculum where they're learning about it every day. And this is what formers can do. I could not walk in there and do this. Nobody on this stage could have walked in there and did this, but they could do it because they had gone through the process, and they continue to go through the process. And we may not think of Indonesia as the place to look, but they are doing great things. And when we develop programs, these formers should be part of the conversation. And I will stop there.
Thank you. And I think one thing that Julie said that I just want to sort of hammer home is when she said, you know, they're not going to listen to any of us. The people that we're talking to are the people who answered the call of that Adam Waffen video. That's why we showed it to you. So those people answered that call. Those are the people that we have to be talking to. And they're not going to be really interested in talking to any of us. So we have to find who they're interested to talk to, and we have to deliver messaging that will matter to them. And you may wonder, we don't have any formers here. You will meet a number of people later today. But one person that we did want you to meet is Scott Payne. For those of you who are at the summit, I'm sure you will remember him from last year. But Scott, can we turn it over to you and just give us a little bit of your history and what you learned from your experience about what kinds of communication and messaging works and what really doesn't?
Sure. First of all, sorry for not being there. It was not by choice, but maybe next year. So my background is I did 28 years in law enforcement, starting at a state and local level, and then I went in the FBI in '98, and I retired in June of 2021. But I did a lot of undercover work, going back as far as 1996. And towards the, I mean, as far as it kind of ties into this, doing the undercover stuff is you're creating friendships, you're making friends. With some pretty bad people at the time, right? But towards the end of my career, it seemed like the hot button and everything that I was working undercover-wise was extremist stuff. Even as a case agent, I was working extremists, running cases against Aryan Nation and stuff like that. But, you know, I love what was just said about the formers, because that kind of goes in line with me, and what I did for so many years is creating sources. And, you know, a former, I mean, essentially, I think a source, and I'm not talking snitch and this, that, and the other, the bad words, but you meet somebody. And for instance, I had a case on somebody for a year and a half, somebody I'm sure has been reported on at this summit at one point or another. And after a year and a half, I'm like, he's not doing anything that's a federal charge. So I approach him and I give him a spiel, but I do me. I don't, you know, there's classes you can take and everybody has their own personality, and you use your own traits that work well. But essentially I flipped the guy and we became buddies. And that guy helped me build my 8-hour, 16-hour white nationalism block, because he had been involved in white supremacy from the very beginning, from Christian identity to accelerationism, backwards and forwards. And I was gearing him up. I didn't know there was such a thing as a former until last year when I came to your summit, but I was lining him up to help me teach, because who does know better? So I totally agree with that, and they should be involved. And again, it goes hand in hand with what I did, gaining trust. You're trying to get information from people. For me, infiltrating the groups that I did, as far as communicating with them, you're right. They're not gonna, there's certain people that will walk up to them and they're just gonna turn and walk away. My skill set allows me to go into those kind of people at that point in their life. But I had to look at, you know, where do they go to talk? Whether it be Wire, Discord, Telegram, Gab is where I started with the base. But it's kind of, if I'm looking from an outside view, from what I saw, and this isn't a boilerplate. It's not a cookie cutter for every person. Every situation's different. But what I saw a lot of, the common traits were somebody that's been bullied, somebody that's an outcast, somebody that doesn't really have a lot of friends, somebody that doesn't have a partner. And then they sit up all night on one of these and start diving into these deep, dark holes of hate, and they find like-minded people. And you get somebody like an Azaro or somebody that's leading one of these groups, and that's what they're going to prey on. It goes back to me. I mean, I'm 52, so it's not a lot different than gangs. It's not a lot different than cults. They would go into areas where somebody is maybe from a broken home, having that need to belong, and they're bringing them in.
Thanks, Scott. We heard Scott talk about family. We heard Emily talk about family. Myrieme, you work with families that are facing this issue. What have you learned in your work about effective strategies to communicate and what doesn't work?
Yeah. So first of all, what Scott said, I'm going to not really repeat the same thing. He's right about what get people to be recruited. And it turned out that recruiters are doing a great job at effective listening and giving what I call the microphone to the pain. And actually, this is how we learn at Parents for Peace to really learn a lot from recruiters. So Parents for Peace is an organization that runs the first national confidential helpline that offers services to intimate bystanders who has a loved one that struggle with extremism. And the reason we end up doing this is because a lot of those families had no idea what to do and what was really happening to them. So the helpline received calls from a different kind of ideologies, from white supremacists to Islamists to eco-terrorism and to far left extremism. So what is remarkable is that many of those extremists come from a variety of background. And I apologize to have to share, unsettling information, but we kind of have to do that. But among our white supremacists, we have people that are Latino and they are Black and they are Muslim. We even have, unfortunately, people that are Jewish and from the LGBTQ that are members of neo-Nazi groups. We have a variety of Islamists that come from every kind of background. And, and many of them move from one ideology to another one, which is startling. Many of those people come from families that are well-educated and respectable families. So this is important to kind of understand the context. And before I go further, Laura, I just want to really thank you for bringing us together here at this summit, because this is helping us and allowing us to put our heads together and to share this information as we all work in the different projects. So I don't really have enough time in this panel to kind of describe what is a successful intervention at Parents for Peace. But usually what we do is we first start with an intake session, and it's important to have the alliance of family members and to help them calm down, because this is very upsetting. So what we do is we follow up with an educational session, to really understand, to teach them about why their loved one, end up, where extremists actually prey in their vulnerabilities and, and their pain. And it's really crucial that we educate the callers very well to understand what to do, what to say, what to not say, because often they end up, meaning well, doing the wrong thing, and that they make the situation worse, and sometimes pushing them furthermore into the ideology. Not only parents, actually, many of institutions do that as well. So, and we have to remember that intimate bystanders are really our best allies, because they are the ones who see the first sign of trouble, and often parents don't call the cops on their kids. So it's important that we give them a safe environment so they can speak and get help. What our team have done really well, and this is kudos to Parents for Peace team, is that we have been able to create effective communication skills. And I cannot get into it, but I really welcome anyone that are interested to speak to us. And what our team have done well is to create a coalition around an extremist. It's really important that we create like a healthy ecosystem to help them disengage. And so the thing is, as we are scaling our intervention, we are facing a challenge. And I think it's important to bring challenges here. Unresolved issues are actually good to bring at this summit. I think it's a great place to do that. But what we are realizing is that what is a barrier to effective intervention and prevention is that we often work in silo. Let me give you a very specific example. Recently, we got a call from a district attorney office about a 12 years old. And the 12 years old have done and said things that are very hateful toward his Jewish gay teacher. Now, so what ended up happening is, the school officials were embarrassed. The county are completely at loss. The judge is shocked. The parents are devastated. And all startled by the question, how did a 12 years old become so hateful, and what do we do about this? And mainly, do we put a 12 years old in jail? So this is really the question. As we were talking to all these different groups, what we realized is that the problem that they were facing is they were working in silo. Nobody was in the same page about what is the problem, what do we do about that, and that's really created this kind of really, what is happening here? So Parents for Peace came into this, so this is an early stage, but it made me realize that what this county have as a problem is very much a reflection of what we have as a society. And in matter of fact, in this field as well, because we are not in the same page yet about what is extremism, how do we counter it, how do we make it worse sometime. And and one of the issues is that what I wish is that if we could really step out from our own programs and see about what really works. One thing that makes me hopeful, though, is on Tuesday with our team here that had been working on this very problem. First of all, I felt relieved that we were very much on the same page, so that's good, and that we understand the same thing about extremism, but also we understand effective intervention. So that is very helpful. So I'm not going to solve this right now, but I am very helpful because also other people reached out to me and said, by the way, we understand the issue of working in silo and how this is creating a problem. We are shooting ourselves in the foot. Let me help you think about that. How can we help? So that was really good. So I'm hopeful and I'm thinking that we're going to make some progress.
Great. Miriam's referring to, we have a working group called Communication Across the Divide. And all of these folks are on it, as are many of you in the audience. And that's really what this working group is focused on. How do we do that? And just to do a little summit speak with you, it plugs into, remember when Brett Steele talked about the directory? Who do I call? Who are the directory? Is designed, at least in part, to help with the problem that Myrieme just identified, is that nobody knows, who to talk to or what to do. Some of the training that you heard about from Emma Cardelli is designed to help therapists get on the same page. So what we're really trying to do here at the summit is to solve for the very real problem that Myrieme just described. So just so that you see how those parts fit together a little bit. Katharina, you are one of the leaders of this work. Thank you for that. And in your professional work, you're doing a lot of work and thinking about formers and the role of formers, and in many ways that is informed by your own experience. And since we've talked about the importance of lived experience, let me turn it over to you and ask you a little bit about your work and your advice for all of us about communication and what we need to know before we start communicating.
All right. Hi, I'm Katharina Meredith. I'm a PhD student in Dr. John Horgan's lab at the Violent Extremism Research Group at Georgia State. I'm also co-founder of Stronger After, a nonprofit that helps people who left cultic groups. And I myself have experience leaving a cultic group, so I understand the complex phenomena we're facing here with communication across the divide. I also applaud every effort that is being made. So I'm just going to take a bit of a picture back and talk about that. When people join violent extremism, cultic groups, any sort of high demand group that has strong ideology as a bonding agent, at first they get a lot out of that, whether it's purpose or sense of belonging, and that is what keeps them in it. During that time, it's like falling in love. It's nothing you can say that will go through. It's probably if your parents told you that person, don't date them, still gonna do it. So it's kind of useless. However, once that love bombing, that initial phase goes away, some doubt might set in, or it can take years. It's not always a linear process. What I found from talking with lots of former cult members in my own research with the former violent extremists and my studies is that part of the belonging that makes it so attractive also happens because the rest of the world gets pushed away and people get isolated. And as a result, they rely more and more on the group. So if any of you, well, we're all good at compartmentalizing, right? If we receive information that would force us to make a change that we're not ready to do, we're most likely just going to ignore it. And in a way, somebody who's stuck in an extremist group and maybe doesn't have many outside options anymore, so let's say they've alienated everybody, they've given up their belongings, they don't have a career, they move countries, whatever it is, more and more barriers are built up between them and the outside world, so that keeps them connected to the group. If there are no outside options, or if it seems like an incredibly high risk to leave, then sometimes the safest thing for a person to do is to pretend that everything's fine. Because if they don't have an option, acknowledging that they're unhappy in it and trying to leave can be a big risk to them. So what I found, and what we found in the literature and other people, is that even as membership starts to have negative consequences, whether it's to psychological health or on a practical level, if people don't have many options, they might stay. During that time, if you try to come at them with counter messages that are logic-based, they're likely to just roll straight off because you're not in a very logical state of mind. Also, especially in cults, and it's similar in violent extremism, you are inoculated against reason. From the very beginning, you're told that you're better than the rest of the world, the rest of the world is bad, is this, that, or other. So as a result, you're being prepared. Oh, they will tell you this, but here's the truth. So these groups are smart. They know what messages anybody uses to reach people inside violent extremism. They follow all the same social media. They are on it. So the smartest thing for them to do is to inoculate all the members against that and say, oh yeah, so-and-so will say this. This media will say this about us, but don't believe them because here is the real truth. And so with that inoculation against reasoning, that resistance to any attempt from the outside to change their mind, you're not likely to go, like, messaging is not going to fall on fertile ground. That is not to say that we should stop trying. One thing a former cult member once explained to me is that any of these messages that contradict your belief system and your all-encompassing worldview add up. It's like you put them away. Yes, you compartmentalize them, but you put them on a shelf over here because you can't deal with them. At some point, all these mason jars of doubt, or whatever you call it, come to a turning point where that last little bit of doubt, the last little bit of thing, and you never know what it is, it all comes crashing down. And that might be the moment that somebody either mentally starts to radicalize or physically disengages and is ready for that and has a cognitive opening where they're like, maybe something in here isn't working. And often it can be leadership is not ideal, something inside the group is just not working for them. That's the moment where the cognitive opening happening, disillusionment has set in. Maybe they have an alternate option available, or maybe they'd rather die than stay. A lot of people only leave cults when they're at that point of I'd rather die than endure this. So when that moment happens, yes, critical messages come up. Again, I remember personally all the stuff that people said in the 10 years of my involvement. I'm like, oh, right, maybe there was something to that. Now, that being said, in the stage where you're actually strongly involved, the biggest thing that goes through, and that's what former extremists have said too, are emotional messages, are acts of kindness, because the rest of the world starts to treat them like the less than, or they're not human, or the monsters. but that's what the group uses in the propaganda, and again, sets them apart and creates a divide. So anytime we can, as parents, as teachers, as even academics, see that these are still humans, they are members of a violent extremist group, but that's not all they are. And as long as we can keep that conversation going in any way and keep reaching out, that will mean a lot. And it will also make it easier to re-engage with mainstream society at the end. And I think my 5 minutes are up.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you, Katharina. I'm mindful of the clock, so Farhan is our Canadian member here, so thank you. Just please note for the record. Farhan, could you just, in just a couple of minutes, because we also want to give Robert some time here, just talk a little bit about the Canadian work that you've done and the factors that you've identified that you think are relevant to this communication issue.
Thank you for having me. It's a humbling experience to be here today. I'll situate the work that DPS does. There's a big map that'll show up on the screen in a minute. And really what that map does is it shows you a little bit of the work that we've done around the world on advancing meaningful conversations on challenging issues. And we've done it for about a decade. And what it does is it actually gives us a platform for learning. It allows us to learn about the trends of polarization and hate that we see around the world and that we can translate to what's happening here at home. We get engaged, coming back to the top here, when people are in danger of sliding into extremism. We get engaged when those extremist positions are at danger of becoming normalized. And so some of the trends and patterns that you've heard here that my colleagues on the stage have to contend with, we're actually observing at the level of populations. And we see early indicators at the level of populations. So if the slides show up, you'll see them in pictures and words, and if they don't, you'll hear my voice. We did a nationally representative survey recently, and in the survey, we found that 1 in 5 Canadians actually agree that violence is sometimes necessary for social change. And what that told us was that actually this starts pretty early. It starts at the level of a pretty broad and diverse population, and the numbers are pretty significant. And in fact, 1 in 3 Canadians said that they would support a group that's not afraid of defying the law to fight for its principles. What we're seeing is this increasing normalization of violence with people being more comfortable with their group actually choosing violence. We see this fueling a risk around an environment where intersecting drivers of hate can actually fuse. We saw it in the context of other issues, take COVID-19 and a series of anti-Semitic tropes. And one takeaway from this work, and we'll talk about the factors in a second, is that actually when we're communicating, we're not communicating across a single divide, we're communicating across multiple divides at the exact same time. And so while one message may be intended to create an effect amongst one particular group, it may have a backlash effect against another. And so the scale at which this challenge grows is quite complex, and it's why we need better strategies for engagement. We found that there are, in fact, a couple of key predictors and aggravating factors. And you're going to see repeated on the screen and in my words what you've heard on the stage today already. We found those with higher fears and grievances across a number of issues, those with higher social alienation, those with political positions that fall further outside the center on both sides of the spectrum, are all factors that increase the acceptance of political violence. We also saw that reported measures of mental health are predictors of the acceptance of violence, particularly amongst younger people and those that we would readily characterize as far left. We start to break these down. We identified a couple of groups. We call them alpha, beta, and delta. If we look at the high-level findings on these groups, let's take alpha, for example, we found that they have the highest acceptance of political violence, correlated with the highest reported grievances and fears, slightly above average on social alienation and more like right-leaning. They were also overrepresented by males 18 to 54, with households under $80,000 in medium population centers with some geographic distribution across the country. Importantly, we saw demonstrated susceptibility to misinformation across a range of topics. So not just one thing, not just one issue or one topic, but multiple issues and topics that seem to come together. I know I've painted a bit of a troubling picture, and so we talked a little bit about the factors that aggravate. What gives me hope is that we've actually seen evidence of protective factors that can reduce the impact of that harmful content. We found that we can actually build resilience to misinformation and manipulative online tactics, and coming back to what Katharina said earlier, we can do this earlier. It doesn't have to happen at the end of the line. It doesn't have to happen in the last mile. It certainly does seem to compound, but we can do it earlier. We do this through creative approaches to online engagement and content. We develop this with experts and the affected communities. We deliver them through targeted approaches informed by research. And what we found is that these approaches can encourage people towards greater skepticism. And what that means is it demonstrates that people don't have to move beyond the pale when other members of a group do, so you can build some resilience. We also found that it can increase a sense of belonging, building bridges between divided groups. And I'll give you just one case that was on the screen just a minute ago. We took our product, we deployed it in the context of Myanmar. Over 1 million people engaged with the platform. And what we found through a series of randomized controlled trials is that it actually has an effect. We saw an increased willingness to interact with minorities, increased desire to discuss minority rights with their friends and families, and actually express support for minorities on social platforms. So I leave you with a bit of a sense of hope, is that we're seeing the starting point of promising approaches that can work earlier in that funnel at the preventative stage, ultimately in hopes that we reduce the flow of traffic to those providing services, like my colleagues on the stage here today. And I think that gives us some sense of optimism that we can tackle even some of our most wicked problems.
Terrific, thank you, Fine. Robert, last but not least, you've done work in this field for decades in many different parts of the world. I think a lot of people in this audience are thinking, what could I do? How could I learn how to do this? Can you share with us a little bit of your background and hopefully leave us with a few words of hope for this audience?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's really an honor to be on this stage and to be at this event. And a big thanks to Laura and her team to get all of this together. My background is really 25 years of working with people who are motivated or motivating people to leave violent extremist groups. So the work of facilitating that process. I thought to just share an example of what does it mean to facilitate this work. In my practice back in Stockholm many years ago, we were contacted by a teacher, a drama pedagogue who worked in a municipality around Stockholm. This was a very experienced professional with 15, 20 years of work. She was familiar with all kinds of topics, and she said, I'm not afraid to discuss anything from death sentence to environmental to polarization or any type of topics. But she reached out to us because she had in her class a group of young students who were part of a neo-Nazi group. And this triggered her so much that she felt, I cannot do a good work. With all my practice, with all my experience, this triggers something in me that I need help to think of how to do. So together with this drama pedagogue, we worked over a few months, a half a year, to help her to understand what is the drivers behind radicalization, what type of processes are going on, and how can we work with equipping her to manage this. And we developed a workshop setting where we worked together with her to reach young people, which was quite amazing. We saw change over half-a-day workshops where people really came out to question their involvement. So my point here is that a lot of professionals that we encounter all around the world who meet people who are involved in violent extremism often feel, I cannot do this. I don't understand this. This is not my type of field. This should be for security service or for somebody else. But the fact is that most trained professionals who are good at working with people are also good at working with individuals in this target group. Similarly, another case of a client in one of the teams I led, an individual who was leaving a violent neo-Nazi group, he needed mental health support. He reached out to therapists, 5, 6, 7 therapists, and as soon as he opened up about his past and where he came from, the therapist said, oh, I cannot deal with this. You have to find somebody else. And think of the process, being open to change, willing to change, seeking support, and then being rejected. How this would facilitate and help and motivate your change processes. So together with the German Violence Prevention Network, we've been working for the last half year here in Pittsburgh, Western Pennsylvania, to set up the RESTORE program, which really focuses on equipping first-line practitioners in how do we work with this target group? What are the processes? How do we understand the process of radicalization, and what type of interventions and tools are important for doing this type of work? One of the things we see is that this is not something that can be done by one person, one institution, is not one owner, but it's really a range of different actors that has to come together to fill the role and to cooperate together. One of the things that we see that binds this work together, and not only this type of work, but what's essential in, if we look at psychotherapy, we took mental health approaches, social work, prison probation, education, youth work, what is one of the key factors that leads to success and change? A strong working alliance, so building relations. So the question is, how do we find individuals with connections to engage with vulnerable individuals or people who are active? How do we find those people to bridge, to build alliances, to build relations, to be able to progress this work further? And here, once again, I come back to equipping already existing professionals and networks in doing the type of work that they already do, but with this specific target group. And we can see this from decades of experiences that it really works. There's a lot of examples of success, and to be honest, I think it's actually the only way we can go forward. This cannot be a specialized field with 5 people on a panel who's going to solve this. This has to be something that comes down to the first-line practitioners on the field who engage and encounter individuals here to do this. So that's my remark. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. I want to be mindful of giving you time with this next panel because it's really extraordinary, but this group right here is the leadership of the Communication Across the Divide panel, and Julie for the reintegration panel, a whole different issue. How do you take somebody who is in one of these movements and help bring them into society? How do you replace that sense of belonging and feeling and acceptance that they felt from those people among us? You can't ask them to make that choice without being willing to commit some resources to them to help that process. So if you have further interest in this, there is an entire breakout group on Friday morning. They have brought some additional wonderful panelists to you. I encourage you to do that. Scott, you come back to us next year, man, and it'll be good to see you here. And we will turn this over to the next panel, but please join me in thanking this extraordinary group of human beings.